Now let's turn our focus on service delivery protests. With just 4 months before local government elections, South Africa has seen a number of service delivery protests flare up. According to the South African Police Service Incident Registration Information System, over 900 protest actions took place from the 1st of August 2020 to the 31st of January 2021. Last week, community members in Harrismith embarked on service delivery protests, complaining about poor service rendered by the Maluti-a-Phofung municipality, as you've just seen. Now, are service delivery protests likely to spike in the run-up to the local elections? Let's discuss this. We're joined via Zoom by Godfrey Mulaudzi, a justice and violence prevention researcher at the Institution for Security Studies. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. 900 service delivery protests in just 4 months. Is South Africa the protest capital of the world?
Thanks and good afternoon. We have not reached a point where we can conclude that we are the capital of protest in the world, given the data that we have. In the Institute of Security Studies, we have what we call a violence monitor that the public could also visit on our websites. It's called the Crime Hub. Now, the trends over the years has always been that if you move towards be it local government elections or the general elections or the by-elections, people tend to, there tends to be an outpouring of anger into the streets. People tend to want to send message strongly to politicians to take issues of service delivery very serious in their localities. Now, if we are to look around, you would see that, and this is not only exclusive to Harrismith, the state of service delivery in our local municipalities is slowly collapsing. Issues of basic services have completely collapsed. And if you see that the case that we have now in Harrismith, where people even demand that the leadership of the ANC needs to come and intervene in the form of the president, this calls or tells us that there's a vote of no confidence in the local leaders of that local municipalities. So we are not really at a space where we can say, yes, we are at the capital of protest, because the trends show us that over the past, when you go closer to the elections, you see more and more of this kind of protest that tend to take a shape of even more violence.
Ramaphosa, you just mentioned the ANC. He earlier was speaking at the 8th Regional Conference, and he actually said that there is a lack of accountability when it comes to leaders. He even said that he's worried about the Northwest province because it is actually in a state of collapse. So when you have a president utter such utterances a few months before the election, what does that tell us?
I think it tells us that there is indeed probably on the space of the leadership, a will to acknowledge that things are going wrong. Things are wrong in the space of local government, and there is a dire need to fix that situation. Now, that speaks also to the leadership that it's there in the space of local government. Now, are they accountable enough to the community and community crisis? I would think that they are not really accountable enough. If the case that we're talking about in Harrismith, for example, this is the case that started way back, the challenges that that municipality faces. Now, these people have put petitions into their local leaders and they have not get sufficient responses. And people, when they tend to take up arms in the streets, these are just they demonstrate frustrations on the part of the people and lack of confidence on the part of the leadership that is not responsive. And if they do, how effective is that response? Is that timelessly? So these are the challenges that local leaders face. Northwest, for example, that you just mentioned, it has faced a lot of, in fact, the state of services in that province has also collapsed. And this speaks to also, again, the leadership in that province of local spaces, of municipalities. The political leadership in that space, is it accountable enough? Is it responsive? And if it is it effective to the needs of the people?
And some of the protests, Godfrey, are quite different. They're not necessarily of a violent nature. And I'm specifically talking about what we've recently seen in Ladysmith or Kwahlati, where, you had people who are desperate for change, they're desperate for employment, digging out precious stones that they assumed were diamonds. And the government coming out and saying, actually, they're not diamonds, they're crystals. And what this has probably shown them is that there is no development in that area. So some of the protests don't necessarily present themselves in a form of violence.
Indeed. I think that, look, the COVID-19 pandemic itself has exposed some of the deep vulnerabilities, socio-economic vulnerabilities in our communities. People have lost jobs, people had to take salary cuts, and this has affected their social well-being. Now, the state of services in communities as well, it makes it even worse for their frustrations because if you look at, for example, the issues of Harrismith, the issues Kwahlati that you just spoke about now, these are people who are trying to make ends meet, who are trying to, with the hope that their livelihood would change, if they would make a breakthrough economically. Now, economic challenges, we know that they also fuel protests. There is evidence to that end. And economic challenges fuel violence. But the link of violence and economic challenges would not necessarily have evidence to that effect. But we have evidence of economic challenges fueling protests on the part of the people.
Perhaps, Godfrey, as we wrap up this interview, I'd like to ask you this. Why is it that South Africans resort to protests? And I think you've touched a little bit about that. But more importantly, is protest the only language government understands? I mean, do we see a significant difference when community members go onto the streets?
Look, it is, we are in a constitutional democracy. Section 17 of that constitution in the Bill of Rights gives people a right to protest peacefully and unarmed. But the significance of that right is to also give powers to those who are powerless, those marginalized communities who may not necessarily have the economic muscles, the political powers to challenge the status quo, to challenge the power that be. So that right for people to protest is very significant. I mean, I would look at the situation in Winsberg, just next to Harrismith, for example, where even minors have been arrested as part of the protests that went violent. And you ask yourself, to what end do minors have to participate in such type of protests? And of course, we know minors and their children do not have right to vote, but there is a need on their part as well to take part in the governance, in the democracy system that we have, in the livelihood of their societies. Now, protest becomes the only tool in their hands to be able to exercise that right. So I think that we need to protect that right, but of course, the violence element of it, of course, there is a need of educating societies on the importance of their right, but also not encroach on the rights of other people. And of course, violence in itself in the process to remove the element of lawfulness in their protest. So I think that right is very much significant in our constitutional democracy, but it needs to be protected. But of course, the challenge, as I conclude, it also goes to the leadership, particularly the space of local government. The local leadership needs to start to be responsive enough, needs to be there where the communities are so that they are able to pick up these challenges before the frustrations get to be outpoured in the streets. Harrismith, for example, and as I conclude again, you have said that the issues of service delivery, as they call it, there is water issues there, there's issues of electricity, sanitation, but there is also a call of demarcation that they are tired of, they need to be removed from that municipality, Maluti-a-Phofung. We have seen in 2015, the protest in Vuan against demarcation, but it also exposed the dire state of service delivery in that area. We have done, as the ISS, a field work in that area, and we found that beyond the call for demarcation, there was also a cry for a dire state of service delivery in that area. So I think the right to protest needs to be protected. It's very much important. The challenge is on the leadership of municipalities and political parties as we go to the elections now. the method of electing their leadership, they need to be very careful on that so that they elect leaders that are responsive, that are rooted in these communities, can be able to respond effectively in the challenges of these communities.
Godfrey, thank you so much for your time and your analysis this afternoon. I really do appreciate it. Godfrey Mulaudzi there from Justice and Violence Prevention Researcher at the Institute for Security Studies, obviously unpacking why South Africa has so many protests in the country. Also saying that behind the violence are obviously deep-rooted socio-economic challenges. Well, we'll have more of your top stories when we return after this. Don't go away.